If you really want to be fluent in English, subscribe us. The man opened his eyes. He was in a small room. The walls were white. There was a bed and a chair. He felt strange. He did not know where he was. He looked around, confused. Who am I, he thought. He tried to remember, but his mind was empty. The man felt scared. He did not know his name. He did not know how he got here. He got out of bed. His legs felt weak. He walked to the door. It was locked. He pushed it, but it did not open. The man felt panic rising inside him. Suddenly, there was a noise behind him. The man turned around. There was another man in the room. This man wore black clothes. He had a mask on his face. "Who are you?" the man asked. His voice shook. The man in black did not answer. He just looked at him. The man in black pointed to the bed. "Sit down," he said. His voice was deep and cold. The man sat down. He was too scared to argue. The man in black watched him. "You must stay here," the man in black said. "Do not try to leave then." The man in black walked out of the room. The door locked behind him. The man was alone again. He tried to remember something, anything, but his mind was still blank. He felt very alone. He felt tears in his eyes. Time passed slowly. The man did not know how long he sat there. He was scared. He was tired. But he could not sleep. He could only think. Finally, a memory came to him. He remembered a car. He was driving. There was a bright light. Then, there was darkness. Was this why he was here? The man stood up again. He went to the door. He had to get out. He had to find out who he was. But the door was still locked. Suddenly, he heard a noise. It was the sound of sirens. The man's heart raced. Were they coming for him? Was he in trouble? Then the door burst open. The man in black was back, but this time he was not alone. There were police officers with him. They grabbed the man in black. "You're safe now," one officer said to the man. "You're going to be okay." The man felt relief wash over him. He was safe. The police took him out of the room. The man did not look back. He did not want to remember this place. As they drove away, the man tried to remember more. But his mind was still fuzzy. Who was he? Where did he come from? He did not know. But now he knew one thing. He was free. He would find out who he was, and he would be okay. The man sat quietly in the back of the police car. The night outside was dark, and the only light came from the car's flashing lights. The officers in the front seat were talking, but the man couldn't hear them. He was too lost in his thoughts. As the car drove through the quiet streets, the man tried to remember more. Who was he? Why was he in that strange room? But every time he tried to think, his head hurt. It was like his memories were hiding from him. The car stopped in front of a small building. The officers got out and helped the man out of the car. They guided him inside. The building was quiet, with dim lights. The man felt a chill as he walked through the hall. They led him into a small room. It was plain, with just a table and some chairs. One officer stayed with him, while the other left the room. The man sat down, feeling nervous. After a few minutes, the door opened again. A woman walked in. She wore a gray suit and had a kind face. She smiled at the man, but her eyes looked serious. "Hello," she said softly. "My name is Detective Miller. I'm here to help you. Do you remember anything about what happened?" The man shook his head slowly. "No," he whispered. "I don't remember anything. I don't even know who I am." Detective Miller nodded. She sat down across from him. "That's okay," she said. "We will help you figure this out. But I need you to try and remember anything, even if it's small." The man closed his eyes. He took a deep breath. He tried to focus. At first there was nothing, just darkness. But then something started to appear. It was blurry, like looking through fog. "I remember a car," he said slowly. "I was driving. There was a light, a very bright light. And then, nothing." The detective wrote something in her notebook. "Do you remember where you were going, or who you were with?" The man shook his head again. "No, I was alone, I think. But the light, it was strange. It wasn't like a normal light." "What do you mean?" Detective Miller asked. The man opened his eyes and looked at her. It felt wrong, like it wasn't real, like it was pulling me somewhere. The detective's expression changed. She looked more serious now. "Do you remember anything else?" The man tried to think harder. "There was a voice," he said slowly, "but I don't know whose. It was saying something important, but I can't remember the words." Detective Miller nodded. She stood up and walked to the door. "I'll be right back," she said. "Just stay here." The man watched her leave. He felt more confused than ever. What was happening to him? Why couldn't he remember anything? He sat alone in the room for a long time. The silence was heavy, and the air felt colder. He started to feel uneasy, like someone was watching him. But the room was empty. Suddenly the lights flickered. The man looked up, startled. The flickering stopped, but the room felt different now. It felt. He stood up and walked to the door. It was slightly open, just a crack. He pushed it open and stepped into the hallway. It was quiet, too quiet. As he walked down the hall, he heard a faint sound. It was like whispering, but he couldn't understand the words. The sound made his skin crawl. He followed the sound, even though he was scared. It led him to another door at the end of the hall. The door was old, with peeling paint. The whispering was louder now, coming from behind the door. The man reached out to open it, but just as his hand touched the doorknob, the door flew open on its own. He jumped back, heart pounding. The room behind the door was dark, but he could see something inside. It was a figure, standing in the shadows. The whispering was coming from the figure. "Who? Who are you?" the man asked, his voice shaking. The figure stepped forward into the light. It was the man in black, the same one who had locked him in the room. But now, his face was different. It was twisted, like a mask, with eyes that glowed in the dark. The man in black didn't speak. He just pointed at the man, his finger like a cold shadow. The whispering grew louder, filling the man's mind. The man backed away, fear gripping his heart. But he couldn't move fast enough. The man in black stepped closer, his glowing eyes locked on him. Just as the man felt he couldn't take it anymore, the lights went out completely. The whispering stopped, and there was only silence. Cold, terrifying silence. Then, the lights flickered back on. The man was alone in the hallway. The door at the end of the hall was closed again, as if nothing had happened. He ran back to the room where Detective Miller had left him. His hands were shaking, and his breath came in short gasps. When he reached the room, he slammed the door behind him and leaned against it, trying to calm down. "What is happening?" he whispered to himself. "What is this place?" Just then, the door opened again. But this time it was Detective Miller. She looked at him, concerned. "Are you okay?" she asked. "You look pale." The man tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. He just nodded, even though he was far from okay. Detective Miller didn't press him. She handed him a small notebook. "I found something that might help," she said. "We found this in your pocket when we brought you in." The man took the notebook. It was old and worn with a leather cover. He opened it, and his hands shook as he flipped through the pages. Most of them were blank, but near the end, there were words. The handwriting was shaky, almost like it had been written in a hurry. As he read the words, his heart started to race again. The notebook was his, and the words inside were a warning. "Do not trust the man in black," it said. "He is not what he seems. He is a shadow, and he is here to take you. Run. Don't let him find you again." The man's eyes widened as he read the words. He looked up at Detective Miller, who was watching him closely. "Did you write something important?" she asked. The man nodded slowly. "I think so," he said. "But I don't remember writing it. But I think I'm in danger." Detective Miller's face became serious. "We need to get you out of here," she said. "It's not safe. We need to move now." The man felt a surge of fear. He didn't know where they would go, but he knew he couldn't stay here. The man in black was still out there, and he didn't want to find out what would happen if he caught him again. Together, they left the small room and hurried down the hall. The building was eerily quiet, and every shadow seemed to move. The man couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They reached the exit, and Detective Miller opened the door. But just as they were about to step outside, the lights in the hallway flickered again. The man's heart skipped a beat. He knew what that meant. "Run," he shouted, pushing Detective Miller out the door. They ran into the night, the cold air biting at their skin. Behind them, the building seemed to shudder, as if something dark and powerful was waking up inside. They didn't stop running until they reached the street. The man was out of breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Detective Miller looked just as scared. "We can't stay here," she said. "We need to keep moving. We need to find a safe place." The man nodded. He knew she was right. The man in black was still out there, and he wouldn't stop until he found them. As they walked down the empty street, the man glanced over his shoulder. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, like dark fingers reaching out to grab them. He shivered and looked away. Who is he? The man asked. Why is he after me? Detective Miller didn't answer right away. She seemed to be thinking, her face tense. Finally, she spoke. I don't know, she said quietly. But I've seen something like this before. There are stories, old stories about shadows that come to life. They take the form of people, but they're not human. They're something else, something dark. The man felt a chill run down his spine. But why me, he asked. What does he want with me? Detective Miller shook her head. I don't know, she said, but whatever it is, we can't let him get you. We need to find help, someone who knows more about this. They continued to walk through the dark streets, the only sound their footsteps on the pavement. The night was heavy with tension, and every shadow seemed to hold a secret. Finally, they reached an old house on the edge of town. It was large and looked abandoned, but Detective Miller seemed to know where she was going. This is a safe place, she said as she led the man inside. The house was dark and cold, but it felt different from the building they had left. It felt safe. They found a room with a fireplace and lit a fire. The warmth was comforting, but the man couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest. As they sat by the fire, Detective Miller spoke again. We need to stay here until morning, she said. The shadows are stronger at night, but in the daylight they're weaker. We'll be safer then. The man nodded, but he couldn't relax. His mind was racing with questions. Who was he? Why was the man in black after him? And what did it all mean? He took out the notebook again and read the words he had written. Do not trust the man in black, it said. He is a shadow, and he is here to take you. Run. The words sent a shiver down his spine. He didn't know why, but he felt like they were his only clue to understanding what was happening. As the night wore on, the man tried to stay awake. He was too scared to sleep, but eventually exhaustion took over, and he drifted into a restless sleep. He dreamed of shadows, twisting and turning in the dark. He dreamed of the man in black, his glowing eyes watching him. And he dreamed of a place, far away and hidden, where the answers to his questions waited. When he woke up, the sun was just starting to rise. The room was filled with a soft, golden light. Detective Miller was still awake, watching the door. It's morning, she said. We need to leave now. It's safer in the daylight, but we can't stay here. The man nodded. He felt a little better in the light, but the fear was still there, lurking in the back of his mind. As they left the house, the man took one last look at the notebook. The words seemed to glow in the morning light, as if they were warning him again. He didn't know what the day would bring, but he knew one thing for sure: the shadows were still out there, and they weren't done with him yet. The journey to uncover his true identity and escape the darkness had just begun.